This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for February 3rd, 2020. Campaigners for various causes use all sorts of ways to bring about change. In this podcast, I'll talk to someone from an organisation who targets the pockets, not the conscience, of corporations they think are misbehaving.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
In a few minutes, we'll have this.
Part of the idea behind our report was to identify what we consider to be the 100 most overpaid CEOs in the S&P 500, and then to look at
who's number one? You have to tell us who's at the top of that list.
Well, you know, there's a bunch that show up almost every year. Oracle is always up there. Disney is very high.
That's coming up shortly, but first I want to thank some people I really appreciate. That's all my donors on Patreon. Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. Her face looks at the camera in a way that's totally different to how teenagers take selfies now. There's no elaborate expression, but there is, for some reason, a hint of a smile. Maybe the instinct to smile when a camera is pointed overcomes her in the moment. But this is not a shareable moment. Her name is Czesława Kwoka, and her photograph has been colorized, but even in the black and white original, the uniform of Auschwitz-Birkenau is unmistakable. The colorization is by Brazilian artist Marina Amaral, and it brings to life a young person who died many years ago. Her face stares out at us across the decades. In one photograph, she wears her camp-issued headscarf and looks up and to the side. She's pretty, but she is thin. Her hair is roughly cut short. Her lip is cut. The photographer who takes her pictures later testifies that she has just been beaten by a guard. Later, when he's ordered to destroy them, the photographer risks his life to save some of the pictures, including those of Czesława. She is deported to Auschwitz along with her mother in 1942. It's not clear why. Her family is Catholic, not Jewish, but her uniform has a red triangle alongside her prisoner number. That means political enemy, so it's possible that someone in her family is in some organization that the Nazis dislike. She'd be 92 now if she had survived. She might still be alive. Lots of people live to be 92 or older. But she does not survive. All that remain of her are those 3 photographs, now colorized, staring out from our new technology and our wondering of what she might make of this new world. She arrives in Auschwitz in December 1942. Some weeks later, in February 1943, someone decides that her life isn't worth reaching 92 or reaching one more day. They inject phenol, a poisonous acid, into her heart. She is 14 years old.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line now, I have Rosanna Weaver. Rosanna is the Program Manager for Executive Compensation at an organization called asyousow.org. I guess, Rosanna, that name comes from the biblical quote, but can you tell me exactly what it is that asyousow.org does?
Great. Well, As You Sow has been around for a long time, and our basic call, I guess, is sustainability. We try to promote sort of environmental and social corporate responsibility. And again, as you sow, social you reap. We have spent too many decades sowing seeds of destruction. And we're working from the shareholder perspective to try to address those, because what shareholders need more than just decent stock price tomorrow is a livable world. So we work from that angle. I don't know if you know anything about shareholder resolutions, but that is a piece of what we do under the rules of the SEC, a company that's in the U.S. Has shareholders who have a certain amount of stock have the ability to file a shareholder proposal. And if it meets certain requirements, it can appear on the company's proxy statement. All the other shareholders can read it and vote on it. So that has been a really excellent instrument for change over the past several decades, actually. Many corporations are fighting it right now, and there's actually an active rule change being considered at the SEC that's deeply problematic. So you may have seen some notices about writing letters on that and so forth.
Okay, so to step back from that a little bit, you're obviously an advocacy organization, and do I get it right that essentially rather than going out in the streets and painting up signs and marching and shouting whatever, you're aiming for the pockets of large corporations, and you're saying, hang on, these corporations have shareholders. We're going to try and convince those shareholders to use their power to change the way that the corporations work. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. The shareholders often do have concerns about the environmental future, and we care about human rights and all sorts of corporate decisions. And we want to make sure that our money is spent wisely and to make the world a better place.
Okay. So one thing that I wonder about that is that, and I couldn't find out who actually said the quote originally, but the quotation is, "The rational man maximizes profit." People buy shares mostly to make money. If you've got shares because, you have a pension plan, or because maybe you're just rich and you buy shares, you look at how much the return is. Do people really look at that much more?
I think they do. And I think the other question is, are you looking for a short-term return? That only matters if you're planning on trading the stock in 2 weeks or a month. If what you're really doing is investing for the long term, for your retirement, for the future, what you want is a stable and sustainable world. Now, often, in fact, the making money and the often doing good often translates into doing well, right? Often, when you make the right choices, you are ultimately doing better financially, and the inverse is also true. The case of coal is particularly a very clear one. A lot of folks at social investing firms, SRIs, social responsibility investing people, and some very good folks, advocates inside the shareholder community, saw early that coal was not going to be a long-term wise investment. The folks that left early did much better than the folks who held coal all the way, to the bottom for many companies. Okay,
so what you're essentially doing there is you're getting at perhaps second-order firms that are firms that invest in other firms and saying, hang on a second, let's not invest in coal anymore because that's obviously very polluting and producing large amounts of carbon, which contributes to climate change.
Right.
That's meaning that those people don't invest in coal, but surely someone else is going to come along. That money isn't going to be left on the table, is it?
No, not at all. And actually, most of what we do is there are a lot of good folks working on straight-out divestment. I was really just sort of using that as an example. But we tend to work more with companies and help identify where we think there can be a change that is both would both contribute to a better bottom line and contribute to a more sustainable future.
I'm sure, you're doing a lot of good work and you are promoting the good causes as you see it. But isn't it kind of unfair that to expect shareholders, who are often, just ordinary people, isn't it kind of unfair to expect them to do the work that really regulators should be tasked with? They're just individual people. They're not necessarily experts in the different areas that you might be campaigning on. I guess they have a relatively short attention span, and they are definitely not, they're not being paid to do the type of regulatory work that government regulators do. Is it really appropriate?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a role for everybody in making the world a better place. Absolutely, we think regulation should be very different than it is today, and we'll hope that happens in the future. But there will always be ways of improving on a company-by-company basis, and shareholders, are one of many stakeholders that might have insight to share with the company about what it can do to improve.
Isn't there a danger then that causes that are most important to rich people will be prioritized?
Interesting question. I mean, obviously there's a lot of talk about that in terms of how money is given in terms of charities and so forth, and that's been a big issue. We have not seen that. I mean, a lot of the investors, a lot of the ownership right now is not by individuals; it's by institutional investors. It is most often people, again, like you talked about, either in their individual retirement accounts or a pension fund or a company 401k. And one of the things that's interesting in that is, if you are in a broadly diversified holdings, if you're holding an S&P 500, index fund, whether Coke does a little bit better than Pepsi is not as much your interest as that both companies do well, right? If you gain a little bit on Coke and lose a little bit on Pepsi, you haven't made money. You're in an index fund. So what you're really concerned about is sort of the longer term, broader look at
just for listeners who might not understand that, an index fund would be something like a pension that somebody else just automatically buys a spread of shares right across the market, and you'd be likely to have shares both in Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example.
Exactly. Both BlackRock and Vanguard have grown tremendously over the past several years and own about between 5 and 10% of most companies in the S&P 500 each. So they play a very big role.
Then I want to move on, because you are the program manager for what's called executive compensation, which basically means the pay for the 1%, the people who are really at the top of large companies. And right. Well, first of all, what are you trying to achieve? What are you campaigning on? So
after Dodd-Frank, after the financial collapse, there was a rule adopted that shareholders for the first time get to vote on executive compensation. I think it was about 2011 that the vote first went into effect. And a lot of shareholders were not quite sure how to respond. CEO pay had gone up and up and up, while far out of proportion to the way either the stock performed and much further out of proportion to the employees' salaries. And so when this was first instituted, a lot of public pension funds and BlackRock and a lot of different folks were just sort of like, well, we don't know, and mostly voted in favor of the compensation. So part of the idea behind our report was to identify what we consider to be the 100 most overpaid CEOs in the S&P 500, and then to look at
who's number one? You have to tell us who's at the top of that list.
Well, there's a bunch that show up almost every year. Oracle is always up there. Disney is very high. Regeneron Pharmaceuticals.
The CEO of Disney is paid about $70 million a year. Am I right?
Oh, something like that. I don't have that at my fingertips, but it's again extraordinarily.
He's basically winning a Powerball every year.
Yes, several Powerballs. And one of the things that we look at, too, is this is another sort of new piece of data that's come out, is what's called the pay ratio, which is between the CEO's pay and the average employee pay. I know last year, just found this now, the Disney CEO was paid 1,424 times what the median employee was paid.
That's not even 1,024 times. That's not even that much of the bottom. That's of the guy in the middle.
That's with the guy in the middle, right? So, we talked about this with Walmart too. Like it's also over, I think it's like 1,100 there. And if you break it down and you think, okay, that's 10 guys working 100 years, right? Or 100 guys working 10 years to make what the CEO makes in 1 year. And you really begin to see how distorted the value is.
Sure, that's really distorted. But why do we care if a private company that's owned, privately thinks it's in its financial interest to pay this guy several Powerballs a year? Then let them do that. If they go out of business, somebody else takes over that market.
Well, and, for a private company, that is possibly, a perspective to take, but these are all public companies. These are companies that have asked shareholders.
I mean private as it is a private concern in the sense that it's not part of the state. If their products are overpriced, people can choose not to buy them. It's not something that anybody has to engage with if they don't want to.
So there are a number of ways that this contributes to income inequality and income inequality. It tracks a lot of very, very bad factors. But again, I'm going to go back to saying these companies make a choice to have access to public capital. And there are companies that are, in fact, private companies. But if a company issues stock to the public and shareholders buy it, pension funds, the biggest pension fund in the United States is CalPERS, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. If they own some of this company, then they have a right and, in fact, they have a responsibility to vote. Right? It's people talk about corporate governance. It's really governance. It's do you vote? Do you participate, or do you stay home when it's election day? And that is there's a lot of discussion of the problem of the commons and so forth. This helps bring what we want to do. What a lot of people are trying to do is step forward and take on that fiduciary responsibility to really weigh in and pay attention to these details.
Okay, and I think that particular campaign is a little bit different to the rest of what AsYouSow.org does, because typically you might expect the companies to come under pressure from people like you to spend money when they don't want to spend money on environmental protections, to spend money on making sure that they're not sourcing from suppliers in other countries who are abusing human rights and so forth. But in this case, you're putting pressure on them to not spend money and to keep it in their pocket when they perhaps want to spend it. But I'm just wondering, because
interesting perspective.
Yes, indeed. But one thing I'm wondering is that they clearly are making a decision as to whether they want to pay $70 million to their CEO. But do you have any insight as to whether that's doing them any good? Is there any correlation between these extremely high CEO salaries and the performance of the company?
There are a number of studies that suggest that just the opposite is true. And in fact, when we looked at our report, we've been doing this 6 years. I think it was 3 years ago, we decided to see how the companies we determined to be overpaid the first year, how they performed since then, and they had vastly underperformed the S&P 500. There's all sorts of possibilities for why this might be true, but there's really no sense that pay and performance. The pay is predictive of better performance in the future.
So wait. You say that pay is not predictive of better performance, but did I hear you say there that pay is predictive of worse performance?
In the specific set of companies we looked at, that was the case. Yes.
Have you any idea what that's pretty shocking, but have you any idea of what the mechanism is there? Is it somebody who's like spending his whole day trying to get his pay packet increased rather than actually doing his job? Or I say it's almost always his.
True. That could be. It could be. There are a lot of investors actually who look at compensation also as a potential red flag. If you see certain practices that seem to be pointing towards, getting as much as you can before it collapses, that's not a good sign for shareholders.
What you're saying there is that some people with inside knowledge, maybe they know that the company isn't going nearly as well as they're letting on, so they're trying to essentially fill their boots while the going is good.
That is one theory. And the other thing I want to touch on is how the compensation can incentivize certain behaviors. And I think the one to look at here is Boeing. If you read their proxy statements the past several years, it was all about our executives deserve a lot of money because we pushed this plane, we got it approved, we built more and more of them. And of course now what comes out is that the push to emphasize speed over safety has completely backfired. It's had a real cost for shareholders, but it's had a much more tragic cost on human life. And so then you have to go back and think what...
You're referring to the 747 MAX?
737 MAX, yeah.
Yeah, 737 MAX, which seems to have been wrongly approved and was involved in a number of incidents, including 2 crashes where everybody on board was killed.
Yes, and they released some of the emails, and some of them are public and have been reported on. But you read these employees saying to each other, "Would you get on that plane? I wouldn't get on that plane." And you think, my God. So what kind of corporate culture do you have? Has the compensation structure played into a corporate culture where people are unwilling to raise concerns or slow things down if they need to be slowed down? So, that is the example I think a lot about these days. There was before the
Can I give you one other example? But it comes from the world of fiction, I have to say. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series Orange is the New Black, but in the later series, it concentrates on the private prison company that has taken over the prison.
Interesting.
And at one point, the one executive says to a more junior executive that they need to have something that, and the quote is, "You must move the needle in this quarter." In other words, no matter what, the company has to show more profit within a couple of months.
Yes.
Is your opinion that perhaps that's storing up, that's happening often, and it's storing up big problems down the line that cost more down the line? But by then, the executive has moved on to a different executive job and they don't care.
That is the concern. There was, in the mortgage crisis, one of the things that came out was an acronym, IBG-YBG. And what that stood for was basically when the shit hits the fan, when it all falls apart, I'll be gone, you'll be gone.
Oh, okay.
So, it is not, and that was in the congressional report, and that is, again, it's not just bad for shareholders; it's a larger ill for society as a whole. We need people to be focused on a longer term for climate and for so many other reasons as well.
Finally, one thing that I just want to ask broadly on the way that As You Sow is working. Do you think that you're running to stand still? Do you think that in the years that you've been campaigning, that companies on the whole have got better? It strikes me that in some cases their behavior is getting an awful lot worse. And I see new companies that didn't exist 15 years ago, like Facebook, involved in huge ethical and legal violations. Are you having any real success?
We are. Because we tend to be working on different sorts of issues. I agree very much. Some of those large companies to come out of Silicon Valley have been deeply problematic. But, for example, and I think you should have Conrad McCarran from our plastics and recyclables program on, because he has a very positive story to tell about, conversations that have really moved remarkably. And it was, again, a situation where it ended up being good for the company too. If they can pay for less packaging, that's to their advantage. If he can work with them to think of solutions. So we've seen a lot of companies move on that, and generally sort of moving towards being green to some extent, and lowering their energy outputs and so forth. So yes, we've definitely seen some very positive things. Also, another campaign that I think has been very good is urging companies to use less antibiotics in chickens, in particular, chickens and pigs. So we have a health campaign that, over the years has filed shareholder resolutions for many, even for decades. So we have people that have been involved in lots of different components. Now, again, I'm the newest program, the CEO Pay program. What we have seen is shareholders getting more involved, and it has made a difference. The CEO of Disney looks like his pay is down a little bit for next year. It's still ridiculous, but it's a little bit less than it was last year. And we're also seeing shareholders voting against pay more often. CalPERS, which I mentioned earlier, has really revamped their voting on pay and votes against about half of the packages now. And that, really sends a message that shareholders are tired of these excessive pay packages that cannot be justified and are ready to take a stand against them.
Rosanna Weaver, Program Manager for Executive Compensation at asyousow.org. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Never miss a show. Follow @ChallengingO on Twitter and like Challenging Opinions on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow Rosanna Weaver @LandisWeaver. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks to everyone who has signed up as a patron on Patreon so far. I really appreciate them helping me to devote more time to researching topics and guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/challengingopinions, or you'll find a link on the website. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.